Below the penthouse, the city spread out like a carpet of twinkling lights. But inside the office, the only glow came from a single desk lamp. Ernesto sat behind a mountain of paperwork, a man whose name alone made powerful people nervous. His suit jacket hung over the back of his chair, his tie was loose, and the top button of his shirt was undone. This office was his kingdom, a world built on silent threats and sharp decisions, and Ernesto ruled it alone. Helen moved through the shadows of the big room like a quiet breeze. As Ernesto's personal assistant, her job was simple: be invisible, yet indispensable. She picked up an empty coffee cup, and the faint clink of porcelain was the only sound she made. Helen was the one person in his entire organization who never flinched when his deep voice cut through the silence. She was the only one who saw the man buried under the weight of his own crown, the tiredness in his eyes that he let no one else see. "You should go home, Helen," Ernesto said, not looking up, his voice a low rumble. "It's late, sir." "Just let me finish organizing these files for tomorrow," she answered softly, her calm voice a sharp contrast to the tension that always clung to him. "Then I'll go." Ernesto gave a small, almost invisible nod, a gesture of trust he gave to no one else. Helen turned to set the cup down on a side cart, and that's when the quiet shattered. The office door burst open with a deafening crack, splintering the wood around the lock. 3 men stormed in, faces hard, masks pulled over their features, moving with a dangerous, deliberate purpose. Their eyes locked onto Ernesto instantly. Ernesto was on his feet in a heartbeat, his body coiled like a spring. But even a king isn't a soldier braced for a surprise attack. His hand shot toward the desk drawer where he kept a weapon, but he was too slow. One of the men already had a gun pointed straight at his chest. "The wolf sends his regards," the lead gunman sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. Time seemed to stop. Ernesto's mind raced through every possible outcome and found none of them in his favor. This was it. This was how it would end, not in some grand battle, but in a quiet, stolen moment in his own office. But Ernesto had forgotten about the quiet breeze. Helen's heart slammed against her ribs like a bird trying to escape. Fear turned her blood to ice. But watching that gun aimed at Ernesto, at the man who, despite all his gruffness, had always treated her with a strange, unspoken respect, lit something else inside her, a fierce, protective fire. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything, any distraction at all. They landed on the small, heavy crystal paperweight sitting on the side cart, right next to the cup she'd just set down. It was solid, dense, perfectly weighted for a throw. In one fluid motion, driven by pure adrenaline, Helen snatched up the paperweight. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. With everything she had, she hurled it, not at the gunman, but at the large glass window separating the office from the secretary's area outside. The impact was explosive. Cracks spread out like a web from the point of impact, and then the window shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, raining down like dangerous diamonds. The noise was deafening in that quiet office, a sudden, high-pitched crash that made everyone jump. The gunman flinched. His aim faltered for one split second as his head turned instinctively toward the sound. That 1 second was all Ernesto needed. He was a predator, and that distraction was his opening. Moving with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size, Ernesto slammed the gunman's wrist against the edge of his solid oak desk. The weapon clattered to the floor. A sharp, brutal punch to the jaw sent the man stumbling backward into his 2 companions, throwing all 3 into confusion. The spell was broken. The other 2 recovered quickly, but Ernesto was already on them. The fight was short, brutal, and efficient, every movement controlled, every strike meant to disable. In under a minute, all 3 men lay on the ground, either unconscious or groaning in pain. Silence fell again, broken only by Ernesto's ragged breathing and the faint tinkle of glass still falling from the shattered window. He stood in the middle of the wreckage, knuckles bleeding, chest heaving. His eyes swept the room, dark and intense, and finally landed on Helen. She was still standing by the cart, hand pressed to her mouth, trembling from head to toe, her whole body shaking with the aftershock of what she'd just done. Tiny shards of glass glittered in her hair and across her shoulders like deadly confetti. Ernesto walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate over the glass-covered floor. He didn't spare a glance at the men he'd just beaten. His entire world had narrowed down to this one woman, this quiet assistant who had just thrown a stone into the gears of his fate. He stopped right in front of her, so close Helen could feel the heat radiating off his body, could smell his cologne mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline. Up close, he was so much taller, so much more powerful than she ever let herself notice. Very slowly, Ernesto reached out. His fingers, still smeared with a trace of blood from his knuckles, were surprisingly gentle as he brushed a piece of glass from her hair. The touch sent an electric jolt through them both. His dark eyes searched hers, looking past the fear, searching for the source of that incredible courage. "Helen," he said, her name a low, rough whisper that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. It was the first time he had ever said her name without a title attached, without a command behind it. Just her name, and it carried a new, profound weight. His gaze dropped from her wide, frightened eyes down to the glass glittering on her clothes. His look was hot, intense, full of a storm of emotion she couldn't begin to name. "You're covered in glass," he murmured, his voice dropping into something deep and husky, both a statement and a promise. The air crackled with a different kind of danger now. This was no longer about guns or enemies. This was about the undeniable, powerful thing that had just been born in the space between them, forged in shattered glass in one life-saving moment. The real cliffhanger wasn't the attack at all, it was what would happen next, in that quiet, charged space, with just the two of them alone. The grand house was never truly silent. It creaked and settled like a living creature, its shadows holding secrets Helen was only just beginning to understand. A week had passed since that night in the office. The broken window had been replaced, the splintered door repaired. But the invisible crack that had opened between her world and Ernesto's remained wider, and far more profound than before. He hadn't spoken about the incident, not once, but his eyes followed her now with a new, burning intensity. Tonight, a storm raged outside, rain lashing against the windows like handfuls of thrown pebbles. Helen, unable to sleep, was in the kitchen warming a cup of milk. The wind howled loud enough to mask most sounds, but it couldn't hide the heavy, uneven thud that came from the front foyer. It was the sound of something or someone hitting the floor. Her heart leapt into her throat. She set her cup down with a quiet clink and moved toward the sound, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. The foyer stretched out vast and dark, lit only by a single dim sconce. And there, in a pool of shadow and rainwater, was Ernesto. He was down on one knee, his broad shoulders slumped, one hand braced against the floor while the other clamped tight against his side. His usually immaculate black coat was soaked through and clinging to his frame, and his breathing came out ragged and pained, tearing through the quiet house. The air carried the sharp, coppery scent of blood, a smell that made Helen's stomach clench. "Ernesto," she whispered, her voice trembling as she rushed to his side. His head snapped up at the sound of her voice. His face was pale, beaded with rain and cold sweat, his hair plastered to his forehead. But his eyes, they were the same dark, fierce eyes from that night in the office, blazing now with pain and a stubborn will to survive. In their depths, Helen saw a vulnerability he would never let anyone else see. "Helen," he gritted out, her name barely more than a strained breath. He tried to push himself up, but a fresh wave of agony made him gasp, his arm buckling beneath him. "Don't move." "You're hurt," she said, her instincts taking over. She slid her shoulder under his good arm, ignoring the cold, wet fabric of his coat soaking through her nightdress. He was impossibly heavy, a dead weight of solid muscle and pain. "Listen to me," he rasped, his mouth close to her ear, his hot breath fanning across her skin. "No doctors. No hospital. Do you understand? No one can know." The command left no room for argument. Ernesto was placing his life, his entire dangerous world, in her hands alone. The trust in that moment was just as terrifying as the wound itself. "I understand," Helen said, her voice surprisingly steady. With a grunt of pure effort, Ernesto used her as a crutch and forced himself to his feet. Leaning heavily on her, they began a slow, agonizing climb up the grand staircase. Every step was a battle. She could feel his jaw clenched tight against her temple, could hear the groans he refused to let out. His whole body was one rigid line of torment. Finally, they stumbled into his private bedroom, a stark, masculine space of dark wood and deep gray linens, smelling faintly of sandalwood, and now of blood and rain. Ernesto collapsed onto the edge of the bed, his strength completely spent. For a moment he just sat there, head bowed, breathing hard. Then, wincing, he slowly worked his soaked coat off and let it drop to the floor with a wet slap. Beneath it, his white shirt was torn and stained dark crimson along his left side. His eyes, dark and desperate, found hers again. "I need your help," he said, his voice low and rough with strain. "Don't ask questions." This was the moment the last of the professional walls between them crumbled to dust. He wasn't her powerful boss giving an order anymore. He was just a man wounded, and trusting only her. Ernesto began fumbling at the buttons of his shirt, his fingers slick with blood. Seeing him struggle, Helen stepped closer. "Let me," she whispered. Her own fingers trembled as she reached for the first button. This was a closeness far beyond anything she'd ever known with him. The room held nothing but the drumming rain and their ragged breathing as she worked her way down, each button revealing more of his chest, until the shirt finally fell open. And there it was, a deep, angry gash, about 4 inches long, just above his hip, still losing blood, a violent, stark contrast against his pale skin. A soft gasp escaped Helen's lips before she could stop it. Ernesto's hand shot out, fingers wrapping around her wrist. His grip wasn't harsh, but it was firm, grounding. His skin burned feverishly hot. "Look at me," he commanded softly. She dragged her eyes away from the terrible wound and up to his face. His gaze held hers, a storm of pain and something else, something raw, something pleading. "I need you to anchor me," he whispered, the words husky, carrying a meaning that went straight to her core. "Don't move, or it'll hurt more." Those words weren't a command, and they weren't a threat. They were a confession. Ernesto wasn't asking for passion in that moment. He was begging for something to hold on to. He was asking Helen to pull his mind out of the fire burning in his side and into the warmth of her presence instead, a desperate plea for a connection deep enough, real enough, to eclipse the pain. In that charged, silent understanding, everything between them changed. The air grew thick and heavy, humming with a new and dangerous energy. The simple relationship of boss and assistant was gone, shattered and washed away by the storm and the blood. What remained in its place was something fragile, something powerful, something entirely new, a quiet romance being born in the dark, waiting to be sealed not with a kiss, but with a tender touch and a shared breath. The cliffhanger was no longer about whether Ernesto would survive. It was about the profound, intimate frontier the two of them were about to cross together. The change in the house was as subtle, and as profound, as the change in the man who owned it. The grand, echoing halls no longer felt like a gilded cage, they felt like a home slowly learning how to breathe. The cold, imposing marble seemed to soak up the new warmth, reflecting not just light now, but a feeling of peace that had always been foreign to those walls. This transformation had one single, beautiful source, the love quietly blossoming between the Mafia king and his maid. In the days and weeks following that intense, life-altering night of Ernesto's injury, a new rhythm settled over the house. Ernesto's fierce, commanding presence was no longer something to fear, it was something that sought her out. He was no longer a distant storm cloud. He was the sun, and Helen had become his constant, warming orbit. He would find her in the library, dusting shelves that were already spotless. As he passed, his hand wouldn't just brush against the small of her back, it would settle there, a firm, possessive heat seeping through the fabric of her simple dress, making her heart stutter. It was a silent message, a constant reminder of the intimacy they now shared. He would glance up from his desk, brow furrowed over some business matter, and his eyes would find hers across the room. The hard lines of his face would soften, and a slow, secret smile would touch his lips, a smile meant for her, and her alone. It was a smile that promised. That remembered. That adored. Their world became a delicious secret, a treasure they guarded fiercely. A kiss stolen in the butler's pantry, swift and deep, his body pressing her against shelves stacked with jars of preserves, the taste of him familiar and thrillingly new all at once. His fingers would lace through hers under the vast, formal dining table while they ate a meal prepared by a cook who noticed nothing, a hidden connection sending currents of electricity up her arm. At night he would come to her room, or she to his, and he would hold her, not with the desperate need of a wounded man this time, but with the reverent possession of someone who had finally found his sanctuary. He would whisper her name against the skin of her neck, Helen, and it was no longer a plea. It was a vow. A quiet prayer of gratitude, spoken in the dark. The big, cold house was now filled with this quiet, radiant energy. And Ernesto knew, with a certainty settled deep in his bones, that this woman had done the impossible. She hadn't just saved his life, or stitched his wound closed. She had walked into the darkest corners of his soul, the lonely, scarred places he kept hidden from the entire world, and with her gentle courage and unshakable compassion, she had healed him. She had loved the monster, and found the man underneath. One brilliantly sunny afternoon, when the light was golden and the air was sweet with the scent of roses blooming in the garden, Ernesto came looking for her. He found Helen not working, but simply sitting on a window seat, a book forgotten in her lap as she watched the world outside. The sight of her, so peaceful, so beautiful, filled him with a determination so fierce it stole the breath from his chest. "Come with me," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble. He took her hand, fingers weaving through hers, and led her, not to his study, not to the sitting room, but through a set of French doors she'd always assumed were locked. They stepped into his most private sanctuary, a walled garden hidden from the rest of the world. It was an explosion of color and life. Bees hummed a lazy song as they drifted from flower to flower, and climbing vines heavy with jasmine filled the air with an intoxicating perfume. It was a world away from the grit and violence of his empire, a secret paradise. He led her to the very center, where an ancient, gnarled olive tree cast a canopy of dappled shade. Here, surrounded by vibrant life and breathtaking beauty, the last shadows of his dangerous world seemed to melt away completely. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. His grip was firm, warm, sure, his thumb stroking gently over the backs of her hands, a touch as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat, yet somehow, in this moment, it felt entirely new. "Helen," he began, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world fall away. "Before you walked into my life, this house was just a fortress. My life was a title, a heavy crown I was born to wear, a destiny of shadows and solitude. I thought that was all a man like me would ever get. I built walls, Helen. Not just of stone. Around my heart, too." He paused, his gaze searching her face as if he were trying to memorize every detail of it. "That night in my office, when you stood in a storm of shattered glass and didn't flinch, you showed me a kind of courage I had never known existed. And the night I came to you, broken and bleeding, trusting you with my life, you showed me a compassion that cracked my soul wide open." His voice thickened with an emotion so raw it brought tears to her eyes. "You saw my pain," he whispered, "and you weren't afraid of it. You saw my heart, the ugly, scarred, broken truth of it, and you loved it anyway. You loved it back to life." He let go of one of her hands and reached into the pocket of his tailored trousers. When he opened his palm, a ring lay nestled there, catching the sunlight. It wasn't loud or ostentatious, it was a piece of art, speaking of elegant strength and timeless beauty. The band was woven platinum, like two souls forever entwined, set with a single deep emerald that seemed to hold the very essence of the garden itself, lush, alive, precious. "This life I lead," he continued, his voice steady now, "sure, it will always carry its dangers. The shadows will always be there, lingering at the edges. But I don't want to face them alone anymore. I don't want you to be my secret, my hidden joy. I want you to be my light. My strength. My partner in everything. I want the whole world to know that you're the one holding my heart." He drew a breath. "Stay with me. Be my wife. Be my queen. Rule this life by my side. Give me your forever, Helen, and I will spend every single breath of mine making sure you never, for 1 second, regret that choice." Tears streamed freely down Helen's cheeks now, tears of a joy so profound it felt like a supernova going off inside her chest. She looked at this powerful, dangerous man, brought to his knees not by an enemy, but by love, and she saw nothing but her future in his eyes. She saw the partner. The protector. The man who had trusted her with his deepest vulnerability. He wasn't just offering her a ring, he was offering her his entire world, his kingdom, his heart, and asking her to rule it all right there beside him. Her answer wasn't even a thought. It was a truth that erupted straight from the core of her being. Yes, she breathed, the word a soft, certain vow hanging in the fragrant air between them. A radiant, tear-streaked smile broke across her face, brighter than the sun overhead. Yes, Ernesto. My forever has been yours since the moment you trusted me with your pain. 1,000 times, yes. A smile, true, unguarded, breathtaking in its joy, transformed his face. It was the most beautiful thing Helen had ever seen. His hands were steady as he slid the cool platinum band onto her finger, a perfect, permanent weight. When he leaned down to kiss her, it was different from every kiss they'd shared before. This wasn't a kiss of desperate passion, or hidden desire. This was a kiss of promise, slow, deep, filled with a breathtaking certainty. It was the seal on their vow, a silent, sacred celebration of the new life, the new world, they were building together, right there in the sunlight. Years later, the mansion still stood as a fortress, but now its gates were open to laughter and light. The emerald ring stayed a constant, beautiful presence on Helen's finger, a daily reminder of a love that hadn't just saved them, but had rebuilt them both, from the ground up. Ernesto's business dealings grew more strategic, more diplomatic. He finally had a reason to build a legacy of peace, a powerful, unwavering reason to come home safely every single night. The dangerous life was still part of their reality, a wolf that howled somewhere in the distance now and then, but it no longer ruled their hearts. Their love, sparked by a glance, flared into life in a storm of shattered glass, and forged into something unbreakable in one desperate night of healing, had become their armor. They found their forever not in the absence of storms, but in the unshakable peace and fierce devotion they built together inside them. It was a forever built on trust forged in crisis, on intimacy born from vulnerability, and a promise sealed in a secret garden. And it was a forever that had only just begun. Did Ernesto and Helen's journey, from a dangerous secret to a powerful, forever love, capture your heart? If you believe in love that heals and transforms, hit subscribe for more passionate, heart-pounding romances. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, and which part of their story hit you the hardest.